Thank you all for joining us. We consider ourselves to be absolutely very lucky and very privileged to have such a distinguished panel. Each and every one of you is an expert in your field, and we're very much looking forward to having this conversation. So, a little bit about who Fiona and I are and where the motivation for this call came from. I'm an educator. I've been teaching in K-12 schools for the past 15 or so years. And in that time, I've specialized in incorporating technology in my classes and working with other teachers so that they can incorporate technology in their classes, always just trying to figure out new innovative ways to reach young minds. Fiona is a remarkable app producer. She's produced phenomenal apps, The Orchestra, The Ninth, and many others. She also has apps for science and literature. She loves music. Am I leaving anything out, Fiona?
No, it's all very embarrassing. You must stop.
And actually, interestingly, one of the coincidences in life sort of was when a few years ago when I was reading a book. One of the first books that I read that really sort of blew my mind in terms of Bach and the genius behind the music. Karl Berger's Bach cycle, Mozart's Arrow. At around the same time that I was reading that book, I discovered Fiona's apps, and that's sort of when I started thinking about what it would look like if the words that I was reading on these pages, if I could interact with them on a touch screen, like with an iPad or an iPhone and that sort of thing. So those two experiences kind of came together. And recently, I reached out to Fiona to sort of see if she would be interested in sort of exploring if any of this sort of made sense of trying to find some way of coming up with an interesting app around the music of Bach's Passions. And here we are, ready to engage in this wonderful, privileged dialogue with all of you. And so if we could start with Mr. Koopman and topic number one, which we very humbly suggested and really it would be fascinating, Mr. Koopman, if you could sort of walk us through how you approach performing the Passions and recording the Passions. So Mr. Koopman, please.
Yeah, I mean, what for me is the most important thing is that the autograph should be the inspiration source. So I would start with seeing again and again and again Bach's autograph, because his writing tells something. Particularly at the time when he writes the Matthäus Passion, he is writing the most beautiful hands, fantastic. It's not like at the end of the B minor Mass where you see he's old and his health is not so good. When you start to look at the autograph, as well in your mind is the idea, is this which version of the Matthäus Passion? We know an early version, which is always called this Farlau version. Well, I wonder if it's an early version or it's a late version. And the version made for all the possibilities, the impossibilities of Naumburg. There was not the money which was possible, and maybe it's all the personal and the quality and the technique which was able to get Bach in Leipzig. So I wonder if this version, where the most difficult one, the final chorus of the first part, is taken out for a simple chorale, if this is really, as everybody is repeating and repeating again, the first version. I wonder if there was a version, maybe even for a single choir and a single orchestra. But that's always in my mind. What I do, the first thing is I check the edition. I check the Neue Bachausgabe. And of course, for some people, that would seem very strange that you don't trust the Neue Bachausgabe. But you see how many Neue Bachausgabe Ausgaben are coming now, new editions made, because like Johannes Passion, many mistakes were done. And so the other thing which you should check is that normally soloists using not the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, but using Peter's edition, the keyboard reduction, where the language is sometimes different than in the autograph of Bach. So you should start there and convince your musicians to change that. Yeah, you start, of course, with did Bach have a big choir, a big orchestra, a small choir, no choir, and just soloists, the theory of Rifkin, and if there was a Corona version of the Matthäus Passion meant to be 20 years ago, or there was a small choir, like Bach said in his necrologue, give me 3-4 people, every voice, so that I can perform as well even pieces for 2 choirs. But he didn't think about his double choir motet, but he was thinking about Florilegium Potenze. When you go into that point, of course it's a very clear left and right. I'm standing for the situation that I don't believe in a version where you have just soloists, because if you read an article maybe 10 years ago by Klöckner in the Bach Jahrbuch, where he found in the Bach, the University Library in Leipzig, where he found in part of the Florilegium Potenze, where the sopranos had written their names. There you see that even the minimum is not 3, but the minimum is 4, and the maximum is 8. You see the names of the boys. So I felt it was an interesting document which maybe gives a good direction to the performing of Bach's music with a choir. And I don't say a big choir, because 18, 16, 20 is more than enough. Next point where you have to think about is articulation. Articulation in the Neue Bach-Ausgabe is often made the same. So German musicology would say, if it's here like this, then it should be there as well. Why? You could have different articulations. What's about temperament? What are you tuning your organs? Was Bach's organ in Leipzig tuned Werkmeister 3, what is quite likely, but on a different note than we do it now. We tune on A, but tuned on G, because otherwise we would have even with Werkmeister a lot of difficulties with his temperament. We have to think about tempo. In a passion, not everything should be slow, but there should be variety. What to do with the fermatas in the chorales? I mean, Hanancourt years ago told me that he was fed up with the long fermatas. He took them away, and everybody, all the scholars were following him and not singing any fermata anymore. Then at some point he was fed up that everybody was following him, and he went back to have fermatas. What you see now is that many people are using the fermatas in the chorales and making out of every chorale not 4 but 5 beats. And if they would look in the Orgelbüchlein, some of the chorales, you will see that fermatas, but the middle parts in semiquavers are going on. There are some early Weimar cantatas where if you make fermata, you have trouble with the upper part. So it's something to make up your mind. Maybe watch in the books with the church chorales and see what's there. And you might discover that many of the books have only for the first verse music, and for the second and all the other verses, they have only the text. Then a fermata would be a fantastic element as a kind of interpunction to say, next line, please. If you would do something very authentic, you could maybe discuss about to have interludes played by the organist. I mean, that was something, they say Bach didn't like it, but he wrote some chorales where there are extensive and very difficult and complicated interludes played by the organ. So I would go, if I have to discuss about fermata jazz not, and I would say no fermatas, but the discussion that at some point in Bach's life, maybe later, the interludes were there, That's an interesting subject to talk about. Another subject, where did the bassoon play? We see with the parts from the B minor Mass from the Missa Breves in B minor in Leipzig, in Dresden, the parts, that if there's an Ubud Amore, the bassoon is not playing. So you have to make up your mind. Does the organ really needs that force, which now and more people are using, that the organ is happily there's a microphone, so you can make your organ a little bit softer. But if you hear a principle from a beautiful Schnittke organ, that's forceful. So are the principles made for playing continuo, or are the softer stops made for that? Do we need an 8-foot, next to the 8-foot, a 4-foot and a 2-foot? Other subject, what's the length of appoggiaturas? When you think in, zo is man Jesu nun gevangen, do they all need to be the same? What to do with dynamic? And if you go to the Johannes Passion, you have, of course, the problem, which version are we using? We have there a more difficult problem. We have only a partly autograph, and the part where there's no autograph, like in the Villa d'Amore aria, Erwege, we suddenly change the rhythm from the copy we have, which was not written by Bach, like the Neue Bachausgabe, that in all the same. If you look in the source, the only source we have, so we have to maybe to trust that as well. It's different. It's sometimes which is much more variety. I like that idea. Every time when you do a concert, I don't know how often I did the Passions, I still have a fear for the music, because I feel Johann Sebastian Bach is much bigger than me. I try to perform his music the way he wanted to do it, and I hope I'm somewhere in the direction. Because at the end, Johann Sebastian Bach, the genius, were allowed to perform his music, and I think we should be happy that we can make a beautiful life with his great music. Let's be handle like that and take him serious.
Absolutely fantastic. It's really interesting to hear that there are so many questions involved in approaching Bach, which makes it an absolutely fascinating thing to conceive, that when a conductor approaches Bach, really there's a great deal of interpretation involved, if I'm understanding correctly, because there's all these questions that you need to ask, that you need to.
Happily as well, because we are much more free than if you perform a symphony by Brahms, where everything is written down, or the Ninth of Beethoven. So it gives us creativity as well.
That's an incredible point. It allows for that great deal of creativity through the interpretation, and in that sense, Jos, if we could continue with you. So one of the things that I was curious to ask you about is precisely what happens when a conductor has experienced performing the music so much and has studied the music so much, and you're answering these questions, a lot of these questions that I'm assuming that probably many of you, the conductors in this call, have probably experienced. What do you start to learn, and when do you start to feel that you've learned it, that you know it, and familiar with it?
Well, it's a difficult question you gave me, listening to Bach's Passions, and I was thinking about it, and the first question that came in my mind is, who is listening to Bach's music? Is it Bach himself, hearing his own music? You have these people in the church in Leipzig in 1727 or earlier, hearing for the first time the Passion. It's the musicians from the 19th century, the musicians from the 21st century, conductors who spent a half lifetime studying Bach's music. All these groups hear Bach differently. There is not one Bach, there is a fashion in Bach's music. It's not only because taste is changing, but I guess I strongly believe There is so much we don't know. Actually, Tom gave already a long list of issues you could argue about and we're not certain about. That there is a lot of space in this course. There's a lot of it not really exactly notated. How fast it is, how slow is the music, what is the distribution of the forces of all the subjects Tom was mentioned. So I think each performer is filling in these gaps for the best of his knowledge. In my lifetime, I very often just did what I learned myself by studying Bach very closely. That was my way to getting close to it. That could be a very small detail, but that could also the what do you do with chorales or with fermatas, the subject Tom was mentioning. And then sometimes with the next performance, I said to myself, forget the fashion you are in and just do it so that you can feel what it gives you. So actually, I think in the course of my life, my performance has changed a lot. Not only because the fashion changed, but also because by studying Bach, you find sometimes details worthwhile trying. So, for example, at a certain moment, it became obvious that you should try, even us in the 21st century, using big organs as continuo instruments, and that changes a lot in the setting. But you only can notice it by doing it, or the sizes of ensembles and that kind of question. So now, at the point I'm now in my life, I relativate actually a lot of these absolute things you read sometimes in books or you hear speaking about. I think it's an illusion that we can even approach Bach in the way he did his own performances. There's simply too much we don't know. There's no recordings, of course, but how did a voice sound? How did one ornament? What tempi did Bach take? We can try to near it by studying it, but we don't know. So that makes that, in my vision, there is in performances, there is a big deal of Bach, of course, and then we have this knowledge coming from the historic information and from the analysis we made. But there's also a big part of fashion in our performances. I think also we now, in 2021, we have a fashion in performing Bach. And it's a different fashion than 25 years ago or 50 years ago. And in 50 years' time, it will be again a fashion. I don't know how or what, but it will change. The chance that they will keep the way of performing Bach as we do now is zero. I think in 50 years' time, it will be different. None of us know what will be the difference. And actually, I think it's still true. Coco Chanel says it so clearly about designs. She says fashion is that what is tomorrow out of fashion. And I still believe we have this point around us now. We believe we are very truthful in performing Bach, but it's not. And actually, is it a bad thing? I don't think so. So I think I like historical information. I like myself to know a lot about Bach and his performances. There was a moment in my lifetime. Originally, I come from the Catholic background, but there was a moment in my lifetime that I studied the sermons coming from the 17th century Lutheran sermons, because I wanted to understand what actually what was done in these liturgies where Bach was performing his cantatas. To that kind of detail, sometimes you go if you study Bach. But I consider all the information coming from analysis or knowledge about tempi and affetti and rhetorics and whatever. I think it's a kind of how shall you call that? It's a kind of inspiration instead of leading law for a performance. So, and that makes that you have a lot of freedom. If you consider all your historical knowledge as a source, a rich source for inspiration, then you are much freer to pick out what you need in the performance in the 21st century. And also, that makes making music and also performing Bach's music to a very lively, Tom spoke about that, a very lively event. And that is, I mean, the worst a composer who is dead can happen is that you have performers who are very strict and basic, doing their historical knowledge in the performance, and then you have a good chance that the composer dies for the second time when it's a boring performance. And so you need, in a way, you need these lively elements and this variation and all these different approaches to Bach. You need them to keep the music alive, because Bach is not anymore there, and we have to do it again with our fashion. And there's one other issue that puzzles me more and more and more in my lifetime. That is that, well, of course, music is communication. You could call it like that. I mean, in Bach's time, it's described so often. When Bach performs a passion, that was a liturgy and it had a function, and they tried to convince the people listening to the music and to the text. Well, I performed the Matthew Passion, I don't know how many times, but very often in Naarden, which has a long-lasting tradition. And every year, something like 12,000 people are coming to listen to the Passion in Naarden. From you did it yourself on that spot as well. Now, a few years ago, we asked people to send us a letter describing the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts they had while listening to the Passion. Just an open question, and we were curious. What do people feel? Or what are their emotions when they listen to Bach's music? And then, very unexpected, we got something back like 400 or 500 letters, that many. Not short ones, but very long ones, with long stories in it. And if I paraphrase a few of these letters, there was one of a man who was in a bomb shelter in the Second World War, and he heard via the radio the performance of the Concertgebouw on Palm Sunday. And since then, every year he went to the Matthew Passion. Letter 2 was a couple who met each other in a performance of the Matthew Passion, and then were now at the moment 40 years happily married, and every year very happily they go to the Passion performance. Letter 3, parents who lost a child and for years didn't go to concerts, but then they like to go again to a concert, and they decided, well, let's go to a Bach Passion. All these letters are different, and almost none of the letters is describing how Bach beautifully composes the denial of Petrus or the death of Jesus. That's not what the people are writing about. So it seems to be that the music of Bach is able to communicate with the listener on a completely different level than it did in the 18th century. And as a musician, well, you can't react on it because you don't know how the emotions is of the listener. They could be very different. They could be even different of the 10 people sitting next to each other in the same row listening to the same performance. But still, all this being said, I think the best approach for us is do our humbly job and study what we can and learn about Bach's music and perform it as best we can and try to understand his music as good as we can. But it's strange that these... It seems a little bit that Bach's music now is more working with association than with content, while it happened to be in the 18th century different, because then the music and content was much more the same and also better understood probably by the listeners of Bach's music. So that is a lot of questions you meet as a conductor, because, well, the only thing you can do is perform in the best way.
which is fascinating to think in terms again of all that creativity and interpretation that I'm hearing is a fundamental part of performing Bach. So it sounds like there's a great deal of study and a great deal of focus and also a great deal of interpretation. And that experiment of asking your audience to express how they feel about the Passions is fantastic, and to see how many different personal associations people can make with the music, which is what's really important to them. And so then, Rudy,
sorry to interrupt you, but one thing comes in my mind. Maybe later we speak about this all of Bach, but now in the time of COVID, it's a sort of blessing in disguise because we can't give concerts and people are looking to all of Bach. Well, now I'm interrupting because all of Bach, because it was so expensive, the project, that we didn't have money for subtitles. So now all these passions are, I think the Matthew Passion is now looked by 1.5 million of people worldwide. No of the people speaking German, and there's no subtitles. It's interesting. I mean, Germany is probably, and Holland a little bit, is the only country where they more or less can understand the German language. But in America or in Spain or in France, there's no way that they understand this 18th century German. And we don't have subtitles in the project, and still the people are enjoying very much the project. So it's an amazing issue.
And it's a very important point, and it's one that I lived personally. When I first started listening to the Passions, I of course could not understand the words themselves. I had to sit down and read translations as I was listening. And of course, there's the added layer of the theological component, which it's not just a language barrier; it's also a content barrier. And in that sense, Rudy, I'm curious with your experience with the workshop series that you've been giving for the past 10 years or so, I think. What has been your experience in teaching Bach's music, and in particular the theological content and how perhaps how do you approach it?
Dear colleagues, for me, a John's Passion, a Matthew Passion, is like an extended mountain tour up to a very high mountain. People who love Bach hope to hear a Passion, preferably as a live performance, together in church, listening to the moving story of the suffering and the death of Jesus Christ. On the way to the top, we always pass the same places. After the powerful opening chorus, it's the mountain guide, the evangelist, who leads us to the several stations of the cross, into the garden, to Gethsemane. We participate in the Last Supper, hear the dispute in the interrogation. We suffer with Peter when crying bitterly because he betrayed his idol. We are spellbound listening to Pilate discussing with Jesus and the Jews. We take heavy-hearted the pathway up to Golgotha, go through the painful crucifixion and the entombment of Christ. When I listen to Michael Tippett's Child of Our Time or Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, I've got a bit the same feelings. Camilo, you asked me what minimum prior knowledge or background should a listener have. My suggestion: to be inwardly motivated to follow the story, like in the opera, like in a film. I propose reading along with a text booklet. You had also mentioned our cantata workshops. The imparting of the textual layer of the cantatas is much trickier. For that, I've got a fine theologian on board. In our monthly introduction, 45 minutes, his task is to show the interplay between the pericopes of the Sunday and the libretto. He also translates the sometimes really difficult text into modern German. My task is to show a few examples of my widespread analysis of the composition. In the last decades of playing and performing Bach, I was able to develop a fine toolbox concerning important aspects of form, harmony, rhetoric, and effect. These 45 minutes are the introduction. I do it on the keyboard, and after an aperitif, our Bach community returns to the church to hear the first performance. Then follows a reflection on the text with a distinguished personality from all sorts of faculties. And to end the evening, we offer a second performance. I've got the impression that because of this modus and our efforts, our regular audience has an increasing knowledge as well as in theological as also in musical contexts. Now back to the Passions. Camilo, you asked me, how might teaching theological aspects be approached? Here too, of course, I count on the help and support of my theological specialists. In the course of my occupation with Bach's spiritual compositions, I studied many and interesting treatises on the topic. Let me sketch out a few aspects concerning the Passions. I've already mentioned the plot, the story the Bible tells us. Why not outline a film script with a high school music class? What I love to additionally point upon is the beauty of Martin Luther's language. Doesn't it sound like music? Jesus ging mit seinen Jüngern über den Bach Kidron. Da war ein Garte, da rein ging Jesus und seine Jünger. Especially this, da war ein Garte, da rein ging Jesus und seine Jünger. And of course we hear the music of the John's Passion. B, the chorale. It is the inclusion of the community attending a Passion just in the moment of the performance. So it happens on another time layer. This is something I always also try to explain. Chorale and Luther's Bible text are two of the most important elements of the mother tongue of Bach listeners. That has changed in the last decades, perhaps even centuries, completely. Also for our older generation, both the knowledge of the Bible and the order of the pericopes, as well as the chorale repertoire, has decreased. In our introductions, we try to compensate this fact as best as we can. Point C. We find personal utterings and reactions like a daughter Zion in many an aria or arioso. Recall the miraculous betrachte meine Seele. What a universe of thoughts concerning this unbelievable gift of God, enabled through the forbearance of his humble Son. And how do you want to explain this to an audience? It requires such an amount of time and concentration. Of course, you can distribute a highlighting text on the subject matter in the booklet, and you know exactly how many people read the booklet before they go to the performance. Perhaps they take it home and do it at home. I just remind you of the immense battlefields of the contemporary theology in Mühlhausen and Leipzig at the time. Terrible. Very much more rewarding for pedagogical presentation, for me, is the differing character of Jesus from the perspective of both the Gospels. Matthew, the suffering and condoning Christ, carrying all sin up to the high cross, and the Herr unser Herrscher, who fullbrings the deed and debates at eye level with Pilate. What would be the image from the viewpoint of St. Luke or St. Mark? A last thought. Working through all the cantatas, one by one, month by month, now for more than 15 years, allows and enables me to have many an impressive encounter with this solitary, itinerant preacher. Just think of the arioso, hat uns allen wohlgetan, after Pilate had asked, was hat denn Übels getan? I'm sure it will be a very rewarding project to write a book on Bach's manifold images of this unique figure. I even think it might be an entry door to Bach's intimate relationship to Christ and his personal convictions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I've constantly struggled with is the theological aspect of it, and sort of bouncing back and forth between, am I understanding what he's trying to convey? Should I be worried? How much emphasis should I place on the theological content? Or as we've been mentioning before, should I only focus on my own personal association with it? And in that sense, John, this idea of the interaction with the passions as cultural objects, and what you've described in your book, in Dialogues with Modernity, as precisely that, a dialogue, a conversation between the listener, the performer, and the music itself. So many different things about how we approach music has changed, not only in the last 200 or 250 years or 300 years, but even just in the last 30 years, how people approach music and what music means to them, and works of art like the Passions that have so much depth. What would be your thoughts now in the year 2021 regarding how they stand up as cultural products, what they mean as cultural products in this increasingly algorithmic context that we're in?
Well, we're not just in an algorithmic context, but we're in one with many, many competing ideologies of culture, politics, and belief. So it's a very dangerous time in a certain sense in terms of the continuity of the traditions that we all love. And that's a question I'm not going to be able to answer in any way with what I have to say today, but I will try to get towards it, perhaps, with some of the things I'm going to say right now. Because I think some of the problems we might be anticipating in terms of classical music culture and Bach's Passions in particular are not unlike some of the problems we're seeing in the world in general, a narrowing of interests, a sense of selfishness, a sense of, the sort of post-truth politics and all that. And to my mind, there is a connection here. I'm not going to say that classical music you only have to play it to everyone and everybody's going to be fine again. But I think the fate of classical music and the fate of our polities and our democratic abilities in the future world, and particularly with terrible crises facing us right now, I do think there are some connections here, which I'll get to. One thing to take out of what I've heard so far, which I think might be worth saying, because I think it's several people have sort of pointed towards this without actually expressing it outright. And that is, of course, that we actually, we as a team, but we also as a classical music culture, know these passions hugely more than Bach's congregation ever did. We've heard them over and over again. In fact, we know them far better than Bach did, in a certain sense. So from that point of view, it's absolutely impossible to put ourselves back in.
Oh. I think we've lost your...
Yeah, I muted myself by mistake. Yes, it was my hand movements. I'm being so demonstrative. Yeah. So there's a sense, I think, in which, we can't actually return to the original congregations of Bach's time, or even to the mind of Bach himself, not just because it's impossible anyway, but because we actually know these pieces so well in certain ways. Of course, we will never know them thoroughly, and everybody has said so far that there's so much to learn about these pieces, and our views and our insights into these pieces changes. The more I know, it's not a question of me saying, I've got more choices, although I do have more choices. It's a question of saying, now I know even more of my ignorance. I think being aware of one's ignorance is an important thing, both for scholars and for musicians. But anyway, to abstract from all those points about our familiarity with these pieces, another thing that I think is rather strange about these pieces is that their rediscovery and full enjoyment has very seldom taken place within specific liturgies, and particularly the type of liturgy that Bach himself used. In fact, the oratorio passion, of which these are the prime examples, is a fairly short-lived genre, really starting late 17th century and finishing more or less with the death of C.P. Bach. So it's a very short-lived genre, and one that's totally impractical for most churches, and one that also is theologically and literally very specific to the types of atonement theory, for instance, that were fashionable in Bach's time, or that were important in Bach's time. And a lot of these are very hard to shoehorn into other areas of Christianity as specific elements of liturgical worship. It's not to say that Christians are not appreciative of this music. It's just that it's within the larger secular field that they have been discovered as pieces of high art. And this is an incredibly interesting question. And taking Jos's point a little further about association being one of the important things about Bach's music and not necessarily the content, I think that is exactly how music of the Baroque works. It works through a persuasiveness, through a vocabulary of persuasive metaphors, none of which necessarily means anything on its own, but within the context and with the right listenership can become extremely powerful. And what was the most important aspect of Lutheran liturgies in terms of the sermon, in terms of the music? It's surely to persuade people to maintain their faith and to keep, as it were, the dynamo of their faith beliefs and awareness, spiritual awareness going. And I think that's specifically what this music does. And it also is a period when meditation, both on a communal level through chorales and so on, but also on an individual level of honing one's consciousness in real time, both within the context of the liturgy, but also within the context of one's broader life and the rhythms of one's broader life, is precisely these mechanisms which I believe Bach seeded so spectacularly well in these pieces, that it's the mechanism that's important, or the association, as Jos said. And it's this mechanism which carries these pieces into the broader culture of classical music, which to my mind is a later culture. It's one that grows up in the 19th century and survives more or less into the 20th. And does it survive into the 21st? That's a big question, of course. And it's this classical music culture which is partly influenced by religion, strongly, it's respectful of religion, but it's not just religious, it's also to do with society, how the individual relates to the whole, how societies are to be constructed in a way to make a harmonious whole, and also how the individual hones their consciousness to make a meaningful life as an individual, whether a spiritual individual from a religious point of view or as a secularly successful individual within society. And the large-scale historical movement and culture that I would say is important here is that of modernity. I can't possibly explain what I mean by that in the time I have, but modernity, I think, is this large-scale move within Western society, starting from around the time of the Reformation, so very relevant to Luther, and taking us through to the present day. It's a large historical development in which the modern subject, the modern human being, is invented or honed through meditative practice, in which one is more aware of different levels of time, both in terms of time that recurs, but also time that is lost and time that is gained in the context of one's life and one's culture. It's a period when the artificial and the artifice is actually seen as an advantage if used well, the artifice of the modern nation state being a typical example of that. Method is an important issue, regardless of what that method brings up, even if it goes against one's inherited beliefs in knowledge. If the method shows us a particular way of understanding the world that hasn't been known before. Then we add that to the pile of our awareness. Empirical study too. So that is what I would say is a snapshot of what one might call the modern mindset, artificiality as something that's advantageous for the future, advantageous for the political construction of harmonious societies. And of course, it brings with it a sense of progress, although progress is a double-edged sword. Now, what interests me so much about the Bach Passions is that they fit between a pre-modern and a modern world view. I would say that the mechanism of the music and the mechanism of the way the listener is engaged point towards what we might recognize as modernity in the 19th, 20th and early 21st century. But of course, there are many pre-modern and early modern elements in this too. The negotiation, in other words, between belief, a sort of enchantment, a spontaneous intuition, and the negotiation between that and a sense of belonging to some sort of culture, all that is, as it were, somehow engaged simultaneously with a more disciplined modern practice of self-discipline. So it's this placing between modern and pre-modern, which is so important. And why is it important? I think it's because you can never have a purely modern society. If you did, it would be probably a fascist society of some kind. It would be absolutely terrible. So in other words, modernity and the modern mindset always sits beside inherited traditions, beliefs, religions, and so on. So it'd be wrong to say that religion is entirely flattened by modernity. And therefore, we are always negotiating, in other words, between our sort of gut reactions and our gut feelings and beliefs and this much more rationalized view of how the world is to be used. Now, what's the future? Well, musicology, of course, there might not be any musicology in 15, 20 years' time. Who knows? But certainly new movements in Bach, which I've been very keen to encourage and try and do a little bit myself, is, first of all, listening practice. And we've had some mentions of listening already. Listening as something which is as important as playing, as important as composing. Embodiment, how music actually is not just an intellectual process, even just an emotional process, but it's a process that actually is part of every feeling in our body, whether we're actually moving or not. So that seems to be another area that to me is important. But as I said at the beginning, there's absolutely no guarantee that classical music of any kind is going to survive into the future. I think one way of trying to keep the discussion going is this discussion of modernity, because I think modernity has been very thoroughly damaged by the post-truth society in recent years. And we actually have to sort of rework the whole of the modern era if we have any chance of surviving as a race many decades from now. And in doing that, we have to take a very critical view of modernity. It's obviously brought many terrible things over the age. The factory workshop, as it were, the division of labor is efficient, but very dehumanizing. Slavery. Why do we talk so much about slavery at the moment? It's partly because modern economies, or early modern economies and early modern efficiencies made slavery so profitable in the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries. It's not because of slavery per se, but because modern methods or early modern methods made it so easy, and so on. So it's a very difficult conversation to have. But I think if we lose modernity entirely and go back just to our base feelings and believe what we want about our identities and so on, then classical music and all the nuances it brings, the negotiation between individual and society, are all potentially lost. So future scholarship and future cultural practice, I hope, will explore some of these issues. Why is this music valuable? How does it tie in with other things that are valuable to us? And my final thought is look at how music, and particularly Bach's music, has started to flourish in the Far East. Although I was sad not to get a gramophone award for my Samson recording, I'm pleased that the award in that category went to Suzuki with his Matthew Passion performance from Japan, because I think that really shows that the Far East, with a completely different background pre-modernity, can bring in modern ideas or Western ideas, which they now actually own just as much as we in the West might own them, but also articulate them and inflect them with a different background culture. I think it's those sorts of integrations of different cultures, Western, non-Western, modern, non-modern, which to my mind, we really have to explore to have any chance of cultural survival.
That's really interesting. And before we continue with Bettina, I think we can maybe add an additional layer to the original topic that I had suggested to Bettina in terms of how modern listeners approach Bach's Passions and the implications. This idea of perhaps listeners and the way in which we listen to music changing radically, perhaps more towards a digital environment. What are the implications in terms of this social construction of these identities that we build when we interact with these great pieces?
Yeah, thank you. I will build a bit on what John said, and I'll try and address those additional questions you just posed as well. I think. Well, the initial question you asked was about whether, current generations, younger generations will never get the full experience, right? Given the context in which they encounter this music and so on. And I think the key thing to remember here is that Bach's Passions have almost always been taken out of context, in the sense that, as John said, they were performed, I'm not going to go through it, but, maximum handful of times each probably. In the full original context setting of a Good Friday liturgy with an hour-long sermon in the middle and other music around it, and sort of in the way that John reconstructed with the John Passion with his Dunedin consort, right? But also with the potentially semi-distracted audience, with some of them reading off their booklets probably and trying to hear everything, and but, from as far as we know from the historical evidence, there was commotion. There wasn't necessarily the kind of focus on the musical experience as an aesthetic experience that we now bring to this. So, and then when they were revived in the 19th century with, Mendelssohn in Berlin in 1829 and so on, they were transplanted into a very different context, right? And they turned that experience into a primarily aesthetic one rather than a primarily religious one. Although obviously a lot of the spiritual overtones were preserved in that move, and that is sort of one thing that has continued to characterize our Western concert culture. I think that there is that sort of sense of sacrality to it. But once if you look at Mendelssohn's version, he didn't do the piece in the full sort of, way it was written at all. Then from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, all sorts of things have happened to them, right? They've been put on stage, they've been choreographed, they've been turned into theater, they've been taken apart in terms of being used for film music, individual arias appearing on discs of, Bach's best loved arias. Actually Bach himself, he fragmented them. He takes a chorus of the John Passion, puts it into the Matthew Passion. He constantly revises these things. He uses the same materials to, write the funeral music for Koopman. That's in the Matthew Passion, but it's fragmented, if you will. So I think that there is a long history here of people, including Bach and his listeners, and then later listeners, engaging with these pieces in very different ways. And I think that history cautions us against approaching them as these sacrosanct entities that somehow either you take the full experience or you're not really getting what you need and should out of them, right? So I'm trying to put a slightly more optimistic spin on the John's narrative, which I think instinctively I very much go along with. I feel quite pessimistic about the way things are going, but we can go around and lament the way in which the digital age has reduced our attention spans to, the length of a blog or the length of a tweet, and it's reduced our interaction with music to the 99-cent track, and so on and so on. But you could also say that that increased availability actually has allowed people to access some of this music in ways that they might not ever have encountered it otherwise, right? So virtually no one has the full original experience these days, as John said. They're not often done in a full liturgical context at all. But many more people had the full experience of the John Passion that they performed in Leipzig this year in April in lockdown. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was very heavily redacted. It was certainly controversial in what it did to the musical substance of the piece, but it was live streamed and then put on the web, and many people saw it and had an experience of a version of the Bach Passion. Now we can, discuss whether that version is more or less what we should or might be doing with that piece. But, my 6-year-old daughter, I was watching it while, the kids were milling about. And so I was sort of semi-distracted, but it was arresting. It was an arresting experience. And my 6-year-old daughter was absolutely transfixed. And she obviously couldn't follow what was going on, but she kept asking. She wanted to know, what is the story? Where is he now? Is he dead yet? Where is his mother? Why is his mother not there? She was really, and, I wouldn't have taken her to a full performance of the Passion at this age yet. But, it drew her in. And I think in that sense, there are possibilities here. There are opportunities that I think we need to keep in mind, as well as the challenges. And obviously the challenges then consist in finding ways and channels to educate people in that they then move on and do get drawn in and do have the resources and the knowledge and the kind of enticement to then want to know more and want to hear more and so on. But I think it would be foolish to sort of denigrate the sense in which there is now the possibility for much greater access, and that's something that we should try and work with and positively exploit. That's my own sense. I think in terms of what you sort of added on at the end there, in terms of the actual physical experience of being there, listening, and the kind of construction of collective identities that goes along with that and so on. That is something that my own sense is that the importance of that has actually been highlighted by the way in which it has suddenly become impossible. In the sense that it may have been the case that the sort of concert-going experience is not one that was necessarily thought about in an active or explicit way as something that is valuable for the fact that it builds community in this way that only presence and collective presence can do. And I think it really has highlighted the fact that that is something that is uniquely valuable. And it's obviously then a question of not just who wants to listen to this music, but who puts up the money to listen to this music and to make these performances possible and to allow people to still go to concert halls and hear them and so on. But so there's, yes, there is a part of me that very much feels the only thing I can do about this is take the sort of galactic view and think, well, we're just a tiny little planet in a huge solar system. And yeah, if Bach's music disappears from the universe, it's sort of, if you think about it on an astral scale, it's sort of, you can live with it. I find the thought very, very depressing otherwise. But I think the task is to try and work positively and imaginatively and creatively with the circumstances we're finding ourselves in, and with the opportunities that are opened up by some of these technologies and so on.